Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Or, well, is it really? Today we're going to be talking about the Star Child. Mostly because since we've been doing some theory crafting recently, I got inspired to do a video that is practically just theory crafting, as the Star Child is one of those pieces of 40k lore that was kind of dumped there in the early iterations and has never really been built upon all that much ever since, really, and we are talking old lore here. I believe this goes all the way back to Slaves of Darkness, in fact, which was, what, a 1988 book or something? Which, incidentally, was also where they introduced the senseis. It's okay to cringe. It's gonna get a lot worse. We will be returning to the senseis in but a moment, but for the uninitiated, what is the Star Child? Well, it's the Emperor. At the very least, it seems pretty damn certain that it is the Emperor. Now, what part of the Emperor is up for some debate. The most likely and most often cited theory is that it is the Emperor's soul. Or at the very least, whatever is left of it, after his material form has been trapped on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. And since we know that the Emperor's favourite ass-warmer is slowly but surely beginning to fail or malfunction in some way, and the entire idea of the Astronomicon growing dimmer, especially with the whole, tearing in half of the galaxy by chaos, etc., it seems quite reasonable to assume that the Emperor's being has been taking quite the pounding for quite a while at this point. One must also point out that back in the older style lore, the Emperor was less divine than he is interpreted as today. For example, in the old lore, it was said that the majority of Space Marine chapters did not worship the Emperor as a god. Most of them knew that he was an exceptional being, the first amongst equals, the best amongst men, and so on, but most of them knew the secret that he wasn't actually a deity. This has more and more and more fallen by the wayside, to whereas today, the majority of Space Marines apparently worship him as a straight-up god. Now, this is actually entirely irrelevant to the point I am making, but I figured it was an interesting thing to mention, as, again, the God Emperor back then, in the original lore, was a lot less deity-esque than he is today. To the point that there was even a pretty solid theory in play that the Emperor was actually genuinely dead, that his spirit had long since been obliterated over the long millennia of endless torment, or at the very least that his soul had been driven completely and utterly insane by the pain, leaving his withered, decrepit husk of a body as simply a focal point. A remnant, a piece of the Golden Throne's machinery, that every day thousands of Psyker's souls are sacrificed to. These souls are then simply burnt like an endless supply of kindling to keep the Astronomicon running. Not a psychic beacon of Imperial might, but rather an endless corpse bonfire, glowering out across a dying realm. Which is a pretty goddamn cool setting, if you ask me, and a lot of which was what drew me to 40k in the first place, long, long ago in the twilight of time. 40k was a lot more darker back then, and I'm not saying that's merely to be an old man reminiscent about a long-lost time, but to kind of put you in the mindset here, because even then, of course, in the earliest mentions and sourcebooks of 40k, there was hope. This idea that this galaxy was essentially doomed, that the game was over. There was no hope in the grimdark future except in the seemingly insane prophecy that the God Emperor would rise from the ashes upon the very moment of his death to relaunch an era of hope. And even that hope was fragile, ephemeral, minuscule. It rested upon the idea that a portion of the Emperor still somehow survived, and could, via intricate rituals, be coaxed into a sort of rebirth, a recreation via adequate sacrifice. This one last lingering ember of the Emperor was the Star Child. A child ever waiting to be born, a glimmer of hope, and a spark of a brighter future in the endless darkness. Man, sometimes I do miss old 40k, because that is a cool setting, isn't it? And unironically, we have gone far more in a more hopeful direction ever since, to the point that today, the idea that the Emperor will one day return seems honestly kind of set in stone, really. As with the beginning of the Indomitus Crusade, for example, there were reports of psychers detecting strange imagery of a golden giant rising resplendent from a throne. Some rather heavy-handed hinting there, but well, you get my drift. It seems at this point pretty much guaranteed that Big E is going to be making some sort of a return at some point in a distant future. Now, we will be talking about that a little bit too, because obviously we're discussing the rebirth of the Emperor, so we do have to have a section on what happens if he actually gets back. But before we get to that, there are a couple other ideas as well. One, for example, is one that the Eldar have, that the Star Child is not actually the Emperor, as in Big E himself, but rather something that represents the Emperor. See, one of the interesting things is the Chaos Gods have a word for the Emperor, a word that means the anti-thing, the anathema, the destroyer, the dark matter of their universe. The Chaos Gods view him as an absolute counter-existence, as something whose very nature is in direct opposition to them. And of course we know that the reason why the God Emperor did everything he did was literally to destroy chaos. That was the purpose of the Great Crusade. That was the reason why he rose up to prominence, to take direct control over humanity, instead of the more passive observer role he had during the Golden Age of technology and the Terran Federation. But that neutrality is of course an interesting point. If the Emperor, as in Big E, the guy himself, was always in direct opposition to chaos, he probably wouldn't have taken this more neutral stance. In all due likelihood, he was once a, quote-unquote, normal man, and either didn't fully understand or appreciate the threat that chaos posed, indicating that he wasn't always the anti-chaos. He simply adopted that stand because he recognized chaos as the ultimate evil. Whereas the Star Child might then not be the Emperor as in the man, the Emperor, but rather be a manifestation of his goal and ambition, his absolute devotion to the destruction of chaos. So even if the man, the Emperor, the individual is dead, even if his spirit is long gone, this thing created from him could still exist. This would, of course, in turn, make this entity into a warp entity, a purely warp entity, in essence, a chaos god. But one that will almost certainly function very differently than the preceding ones, as again, this is based on the Eldar's understanding of the warp, as they once managed to command it and make it do their wishes. For the Eldar and the Old Ones, the warp was once a simple tool. They know that it can be affected. They know it can be shaped and hammered into specific beings. And so the idea of a Emperor-like warp entity creature, or more correctly, rather than the Emperor himself, a counterforce to chaos, seems entirely theoretically possible. Now, in this case, the birth of the Star Child was probably not be an actual birth of an emperor or a re-emergence of the emperor. Rather, it would be the creation of an anti-force within chaos. Maybe it would lead to a rivaling chaos entity, a different god along the lines of Khornes, the Netazines, etc., that would wage war against them, probably in an endless, pointless stalemate. Or maybe, being a creature of anti-chaos in the warp, it would instead work as a sort of neurotoxin inside the body of the warp, which would in turn cleanse it by, well, introducing antimatter into that universe of matter. This is, in many ways, the Eldar's hope, in that the Star Child will be born, and in so doing, cleanse the galaxy of the taint of chaos forever by, in essence, destroying itself and the warp in the process. This is the less interesting and more kinda just underwhelming theory, in my opinion, because the warp just ceasing to be feels like a kind of a massive letdown in many ways, storytelling-wise anyways. Another theory is that this portion, the Star Child, isn't the Emperor himself again, but rather an essence of the Emperor, a part of him that he deliberately separated, cut off, and cast into the warp. Now, the romantic interpretation is that this is his compassion that he threw out when he realized that he had to kill his favored son Horus. I call bullshit on this one, because whilst it's very romantic, it's like, okay, he realized he had to sever his last attachment and become the true anti-chaos thingy, etc. That's cute and all, but at that point, Horus had been waging war against him for the better part of years and years and years. The Emperor boarded his flagship specifically to face and kill the damn man. And even if he hesitated and thought maybe there was a fragment of his son there that could be saved, etc., it seems overly floaty and nonsensical to suggest this whole separation of being. I would rather like the theory, however, that maybe the Emperor understood what was happening, and he elected to place a seed of himself into the future, a portion of himself. There's also, of course, a question of how much the Emperor understood about what was going on, as there are suggestions that the Emperor planned all of this all along to make himself a god. I think that's complete and utter nonsense, because everything he did seemed to be in opposition to this goal, but it is a theoretical possibility. And it would make sense if the Emperor understood the potential danger of Chaos winning, or even just a stalemate, that he would create some form of long-shot contingency plan. And what better contingency plan than creating an opportunity for your own rebirth? Now, this also touches upon some interesting things as well, the idea of rebirth. So, what are we actually talking about here? Because if we assume that the Star Child is the Emperor, or a facet of the Emperor, and it is set to return at some point, what kind of a return are we actually talking about here? Let's begin with the original idea, and this is where we get to the cringes maximus again. The senseis. Oh, God help me, the senseis. Okay, so in old lore, the Emperor had sons. Not the Primarch, no. Actual, literal, biological sons. Direct descendants of the Emperor himself, which he presumably had with Erda, I guess. Now, the canon nature of this is highly up in the air at the moment with, the introduction of Erda, and God help me, I hate that character. But it is entirely conceivable that the Emperor, before he met Erda, had himself a couple of nights on the town and impregnated some lovely ladies here and there. Why the hell not? You are a, 20 feet tall superhuman, after all. I'm sure you could get laid quite easily. And, his... his superhuman seed wouldn't simply just, turn their vaginas into liquid goop? I don't know. I mean, can you imagine the Emperor having sex and not breaking whomever he's doing it with? All I'm saying is there are some decided logistical problems at play here, but anywho, skipping over the complicated nature of the Emperor's sex life, he managed somehow. Maybe he did the whole Zeus thing and turned himself into droplets of golden water or something. Anywho, moving past the Emperor's sex life, he did it, and created his children, which are referred to as sensei. Yes, literally sensei, as in the Japanese word for teacher or expert or, vaunted master, etc. And yes, it is as cringe as it goddamn sounds, but listen, back then, nobody understood what sensei meant, alright? This was long before anime and manga became even remotely popular in the West, and I'm sure that some member of GW heard the word and were like, wow, that sounds cool, that one. And to make matters worse, one of the sensei's names was Captain Eternal. Oh, kill me. Oh, okay, right. So maybe not everything was better about old 40k. This was also the age of Sherlock, Clouseau, Obi-Wan, etc. Anywho, the idea is that the actual children of the Emperor are immortal. Straight up immortal. Like, you can't kill them even if you tried, really. And they are very, 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 very powerful, in that they have special powers that appear to be coming from some unknown source, presumably the Star Child, which is in turn the Emperor himself. But this power is a two-way street. And so the Illuminati, yes, seriously, the Illuminati, theorize that if all of the senseis can be made to return their power simultaneously at just the right moment of inflection and fluctuation, then the Emperor can be reborn via their power, or essentially all of the Emperor's scattered potential coming back together in the same solar instance. This is the original idea of the Emperor's rebirth. The Illuminati, of course, had been scouring the galaxy for the sensei, trying to get them on their side, indoctrinating them, and preparing them for their role in the future. Not informing them about the whole sacrificing part, mind you, but instead telling them that they will be protectors of humanity, knights, great warriors, and champions of a brighter future, which, sadly they won't see, but hey, details, details. I'm sure it was all in the fine writing of the contract they signed. Now, this theory has a few issues in that there are also, evil sensei, and yes, so the evil sensei are called grey senseis because this took more than a little inspiration from Star Wars. More than a little. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the evil Jedi of the 41st millennium might not be entirely up for the whole sacrifice yourself for the greater glory of the God Emperor thing. There's also the problem that, well, this assumes that the Emperor's biological children somehow can resurrect his spirit through, well, warp nonsense, basically, or that there's a certain quantity of, sensei power that they need. It also raises the question as to why don't you just do it right away? In fact, there are splinter groups of the Illuminati that are forwarding that very argument. If we can rebirth the Emperor by killing off his children, why not start today. And the explanation for the why not start today thing is that it must be done at the very last absolute moment, that the Emperor must in essence die first, and then the ritual must be carried out, otherwise the rebirth will fail because all of the Emperor isn't there yet, I presume, or his soul is wrong or something or another. And this does make a certain degree of sense, despite my lambastation of it a moment earlier, as in the old law, the Emperor, again, was not just a man. This is a more new law and Horus Heresy thing. Back in the original law, the Emperor was the spirit, or the amalgamation of the spirits of all the most powerful shamans and magicians and psychers across human history, making him more of a psychic manifestation rather than a human. Adding yet further logistical hurdles to the whole fucking and having children things, incidentally, but oh well, details. We're past that point now, and so if we assume this to be correct, that the Emperor is a amalgamation of souls, then surely you could potentially replicate this phenomena by taking another bunch of incredibly powerful souls, his children, and smashing them together. Whether that would result in the Emperor or some brand new psychic entity, well, plot contrivance would no doubt have decided. And considering that this course of action would have been the absolute last resort at the de facto end of the universe, whatever happened next couldn't possibly be much worse than the alternative. Always a good position to start from, in my opinion. But let's entertain this thought for a second, shall we? Let us assume that the Emperor is reborn. Well, immediately we've got a bunch of different rebirths to consider. Firstly, the sensei sacrifice. This is probably the one where it is the most difficult to draw any real conclusions because, well, it's so old law, we don't even really know who the Emperor was back then. That's one of the problems with answering the question, what would happen if the Emperor returned? Because he has been written and rewritten so many times by so many authors, we have no goddamn clue who he was. I did an entire video on this, probably months ago now, but the Emperor as a character has embodied damn near every character trait you can imagine at this point. He's been the clever manipulator, he's been the loving father, he's been the careless father, and he's been the idiot manipulator. He has been the best of man and the worst of man 7 times over, the most honorable and the most vile over and over again. But let's try and come up with a bit more of a cohesive answer to the question rather than the one GW is currently trying to confuse us with. Beginning with the sensei. So, okay, old school Warhammer lore. The God Emperor is the man who led the Great Crusade. He was the one who slew Horus, he was the one who created the Primarchs, he was the one who did all of that cool nonsense, rather than, the current Emperor who has had most of his achievements stolen by his wife and random scientists by the name of Astartes. Okay, well, separated between the Emperor and Neoth, there you go. God, I hate what they've done to him. If this Emperor returned, and let us assume that once the sensei are sacrificed, this is the Emperor that comes back. Okay. At this point in time, the Imperium is probably absolutely boned. The Emperor is dead, the Astronomicon has at best flickered, possibly gone out entirely, and what you're essentially looking at is a second night, where all of humanity's various colonies and holdouts will be separated from one another by the galactic darkness. Maybe the Emperor can jury-rig some sort of a solution, but it's probably not going to be anywhere near as powerful as the Astronomicon. And he's probably going to have to embark on a whole campaign of conquest and scientific discovery to re-stabilize and recreate some sort of it, or he will simply have to expand within the limits of its light, at the very least initially. but he probably would do so. This is, if anything, the most boring what-if scenario, because if the old-school Emperor returned, he'd probably heave a heavy sigh and then square his shoulders and get back to work. This is his eternal task, after all. And this isn't the first time he has seen the entirety of humanity be reset to 0. This would also be more or less the same, albeit a much better scenario, if the Emperor was to return in modern-day 40k, as a rebirth created by the Star Child. In the case of the Emperor of modern-day 40k returning, again, he's probably going to be having much the same reaction. He is going to have a serious bout of depression initially, as he realizes how far his sons have fallen, and just how many pieces there are to be picked up, but it's not his first time seeing humanity reset to dirt and gravel either, and he'll probably just get on with it. However, to make this a little bit more interesting, let's consider the scenario where the Star Child was the Emperor's compassion, his care for humanity that he threw away and planted as a seed for the future, right? Okay. This opens up two possibilities. The first is that, this is actually the Star Child, in which case the Emperor will return as a giant waffling pussy, which is going to not be very useful for anyone, frankly, as is the thing. It sounds all lovely, doesn't it? Oh, the Emperor's compassion, oh, he's such a nice guy. Yeah, but the Emperor wasn't a nice guy. He was a winner. He was the anathema to chaos. He was the guy defending humanity against the darkness. He was the guy who had made it his personal goal to destroy, well, Satan 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can't be a nice guy and have any hope of achieving that. The Emperor lied. The Emperor cheated. The Emperor stole. The Emperor did whatever he needed to do to win. And you have to. If the Emperor returns and he is literally just his own compassion, I imagine he'd just shut himself in the palace. Best case scenario, maybe he'd pull a Vulcan, where he'd just start wandering the galaxy, helping 2 or 3 people here and there every decade or so, rather than, being an enormous force for good on a galactic scale. I hate what they did to Vulcan, incidentally. I get it. Vulcan is very compassionate, he looks at the Imperium and goes like, well, you're a little bit of a grumpy puss, and fair enough. But imagine the good he could do if he just... We're not gonna go there. It's very annoying and he makes me angry. The Emperor would probably do the same thing. Or even worse, he'd see how far humanity has fallen and go like, oh, this was all my fault. My ambition has ruined us. Woe is me. And he'd languish in self-torment and cry about it. To put it rather bluntly, I don't think the Emperor's compassion is going to be at all useful in the 41st millennium. See, it's one of those key core misunderstandings that a lot of tourists have about 40k. This idea that the Emperor, or the Imperium more correctly, has the option to be nice. It doesn't. The Imperium isn't evil because it wants to. It isn't incredibly oppressive and genocidal to alien species just for shits and giggles. It has to. This is the species in survival mode. Everything we've bumped into so far has tried to genocide us. We are fighting the Tyranids, who literally wants to devour the entire galaxy. We are fighting the Necrons, who wants to harvest the entire galaxy's pain and sorrow. We are fighting Chaos, a literal anathema force to us that wishes to see us all descend into darkness and anarchy. We are fighting orcs, who ravage entire planets literally because they're having a bit of a giggle about it. Tolerance is not an option. Compassion is not an option. Diplomacy, well, maybe with the Eldar and the Tau on occasion, but even then, the Tau only engage in diplomacy so long as it benefits them, and same for the Eldar, incidentally. This is not a universe in which simply being a lovely dude is going to help very much. So this Emperor would be by far the most useless of the bunch. But here's an interesting thought. If the Emperor threw away his love and compassion and all that, and that became the Star Child, okay, fair enough. What if the Emperor was then reborn through some other means? Because the Emperor, as in his physical shell, is still on the Golden Throne. If his psyche, his spirit, his being is still within that rotting carcass, well, he could still be revived as well. This isn't necessarily a one or the other scenario. Hell, both could potentially exist at the same time. Now that would be interesting. I imagine real Big E would have some choice words to speak to his soft self. But in this case, what if the Emperor returned and he had thrown away his last bit of remorse, the thing holding him back, because the Emperor was way too goddamn soft on multiple occasions throughout the Horus Heresy. This is one of the things that also annoy me. This is going to turn into a full-on personal rant about how much I dislike the current direction of the Emperor. I'll try to avoid it, but I'll say sorry now, because I probably can't. The Emperor is actually way too good of a dude. He keeps going out of his way to allow his sons to do as they please, even when they are blatantly betraying him. When Lorgar continued to violate his edicts for years and years and years and years, what did the Emperor do? Did he simply chop his head off, as he should have, crushed his testicles in an enormous olive press? No. He sent Guilliman, if anything, the most tactful and dour and diplomatic of his sons, to go, gosh darn it, does it stop, okay? I'm going to make it... See, look here. This is what your idolatry leads to. Boom. See? Bad shit, okay? Hell, Guilliman was the correct choice as well. Could you imagine him sending anyone else and Fulgrim acting like he did, huh? Can you imagine if there was, oh, I don't know, Russ or Mortarion? Hell, even Sanguinius would probably have gotten a little bit out of hand, everything considered. No, Guilliman was probably the correct choice. Dawn probably would have taken it a bit too far, because he's Dawn, after all. And Angron, God help me. The entire writing point there, where he saves Angron, quote-unquote, he could have simply just annihilated the enemy army, but he goes like, no, this'll make Angron enemy of me for life, let me do this instead, and then just lets him live. Again, despite the fact that he is blatantly deformed, he is a failure of a son. Frankly, that point is the even more important one. Everyone else had conquered their homeworld by the time the Emperor found them. Angron had his ass cornered and was about to get killed by mere mortals. Clearly, this is a defective product, but the Emperor cared far too much for his children. If this last weakness of his was eradicated, you know what? This Emperor would probably be the Emperor that the Imperium deserved. No more nonsense about, oh, I'm going to have a more democratic future. We're going to have a parliament and everything. We are going to try representative democracy. No, he's just going to be like, okay, so you bastards have been fucking up a lot of shit in my absence. We're gonna go full authoritarian now. And I mean full. No more self-rule. No more individual world governance. I am going to run this entire shit show from my office directly. And he'd probably pull it off. I imagine the punishments for heresy would be, if anything, even more strident. The Inquisition would be let loose upon the galaxy with a carte blanche. Even greater than they currently have. The Grey Knights would probably be sent screaming into the Eye of Terror to launch a counterattack at that point. And the Space Marines? Oh, he'd be building those up like nobody's business. But he probably would be a bit more picky about his commanders the next time around. And he'd probably move into a period of absolute, utter, straight-up genocide. A war against individual opponents with absolute eradication as the goal. Can you imagine if the Emperor really set his heart to wiping out the Tyranids? Well, we can kind of imagine what that would look like, because he did that once against the Orcs, and they ceased being in existence in the galaxy for some 3,000 years. Oh yeah, when the Emperor gets serious, oh boy, does he get serious. And he would have the entirety of the resources of the Imperium current day at his disposal. Far more resources than he had during the Great Crusade. Massively more so. They'd barely even begun taxing most of their systems during the beginning of the Horus Heresy. His armies would be immeasurably more vast. And as for the loss of technology, again, he's the Emperor. He could probably recreate it all from memory if he so choose. And as for the Mechanicum, again, he's the Omnisci as well. They're gonna fall in line toot sweet when he shows up, does his usual magic mumbo jumbo, and goes, okay, this is the blueprint for like half of the STCs in the galaxy. Fall in line or else. This is the Emperor that the Imperium and humanity needs to see returned. Oh, it's not going to be pleasant when he eventually wins. It's still going to be a pretty shitty galaxy ruled over by an absolute unforgiving despot, probably in the same way that Conrad Curse would have done if he was a pinch more sane. But at least humanity's future would, in this case, be absolutely guaranteed. An incredibly oppressive future, sure, but hey, it's Tuesday in the far-flung future. We must consider one quick little counter-argument to this, though, and that is the fact that this would be current year Emperor, Neoth Emperor. And Neoth is nowhere near as much of a badass as his old-school predecessor is. Neoth did not create the Primarchs by himself. He had a lot of help. Neoth didn't create the Space Marines by himself. In fact, it was more or less the job of a scientific team that no longer exists. Neoth really did very few things. Most of his achievements have been stripped away from him and attributed to somebody else. Now, Cole is still around, so he could possibly go like, oh, hey, Cole, I'm far stupider than you thought I was. Please help. In which case, that's an avenue of approach, I do suppose. But Neoth, even if he went full crazy, would probably never be able to be quite so ruthless and efficient as the old-school Emperor would. Even then, simply having the Emperor would be an enormous morale boost and a fantastic rallying cry across the galaxy. It would also allow the Imperium to fully weaponize the Ecclesiarchy again as well. See, one of the reasons why the Ecclesiarchy aren't allowed to have any men under arms today, thus the Sisters of Battle were created, is because they had a nasty habit of creating apostates, people who said that, actually, I do speak for the Emperor, yes, only I, and I'm going to declare war on everybody else because of it. With the Emperor literally walking amongst humanity, that's going to be a significantly more difficult claim to make. And indeed, the increased zealotry of humanity might become a tremendous strength for the Emperor. Chaos's greatest power is its ability to mobilize like 90% of the population against their enemies, drowning them in endless hordes of crazy zealots. Well, with the Emperor leading the charge, they might be able to recreate that. And for all the Imperium's woes, it is still, by a metric mile, the largest population base in the galaxy. However, all of this would still just be the Emperor waging war in the same way he always has. What if we entertained that the Eldar might for once know what they're talking about, and that the Star Child is some sort of ticking anti-warp bomb nestling cozily within the warp itself? That the Emperor will return not as a man, but a force of anti-chaos? Well, there are a couple of possibilities here. Let's begin with the idea of him being anathema to chaos. I would imagine that what the Eldar would prefer is that he would re-emerge, go boom, and wipe out the warp entirely, or create a second catastrophe within the warp that would quieten it back down again. As initially, when the Eldar had control over the warp, it was described as a quiet ocean, only disturbed when the Eldar needed something. When the Chaos Gods began emerging, of course, that quiet ocean got a lot more interesting. And that is what's causing all of the problems today. This is a bit of a stretch because, of course, there already exists sort of kind of an anti-chaos god in the form of Malice, who is not at all fond of his brother's mischief, and the other chaos gods are also constantly at war with one another. So the idea that some separate entity would be created and this would be powerful enough to wipe out all the others seems exceptionally unlikely. Now, granted, the warp does whatever people believe that the warp does, so it's not impossible that if enough people thought that the Star Child was this ticking slate cleaner, then maybe, but it seems like an extreme long shot. If anything, it would rather create some sort of a counter-force within the warp. Some sort of, cancer might be the adequate term, actually, that began eating away at the fabric of its existence, much like chaos is eating away at the fabric of our reality. A counter-chaos influence. This could be interesting, as it would place the Chaos Gods on a bit of a timer, really, and force them to try and get something really done in reality. One of the main reasons why the Chaos Powers fail as often as they do is that they keep getting in one another's way, and the fact that they so rarely can unify behind anyone. To this day, the best one they found was still Abaddon, and I should tell you something, considering how many times he's messed up. Oh, sparing the rewrites, I suppose. But what if he became a warp entity? So this is the second option. If the Emperor became an actual, genuine, literal god. Well, he probably already is to a degree, in that there are all sorts of rumors about angels of the Emperor. We talked about Imperial saints a while ago, for example, and it is blatantly obvious that they have access to powers that normal people simply don't. I mean, they can literally be reborn from the dead, after all. That's relatively rare, to put it mildly. Now again, this could be explained by other things, like, for example, stable psychers or just general warp nonsense, but the most likely explanation does seem to be that they have become demons of the God Emperor. We also have the Legion of the Damned as another example of this, possessing powers that are clearly far beyond those of regular space marines. You know, being constantly on fire and stuff, and having the ability to appear seemingly wherever they want, for whatever reasons they want. Again, a bit beyond the usual remits of a Space Marine chapter. But these things can also be explained by a warp entity that isn't actually sentient, that it is simply an echo of the Emperor rather than the Emperor himself acting upon the galaxy. This seems reasonable, as the Saints and the Astartes, the Legion of the Damned, they appear with some degree of direction, clearly, in that they arrive in times of great and dire need, or in particularly auspicious moments like the return of Saint Sabbat, for example. But this alone is not enough to suggest, or more correctly, clearly prove, a guiding intelligence, as surely if this was the Emperor, he'd probably be looking at ways to increase his fighting forces and become more proactive, as the occasional needle poke here and there is hardly going to make all that much of a difference, really. But if this is simply just the power of the God Emperor without his intelligence, as that is still trapped in reality inside of his body, then one might speculate, yet again, that when the Emperor dies, his spirit, finally free, will enter into the Imperium, like all souls do. But whereas normal souls are swiftly devoured by the warp entities that prowl its unforgiving depths, the Emperor is a bit of an unusual soul, and might very well be something completely different in the warp. He might be able to fight off the Predators, being anathema to chaos as he is. He might even be inherently poisonous to them. They might not be able to touch him at all because of his very nature. In which case, you now have the Emperor's intellect in the warp, all of his psychic powers, and the ability to affect the warp from the inside. Now, this is making the assumption that he retains his psychic powers, or that he is able to merge with this already existing warp entity, or that his soul retains any potency at all within the warp. He might simply just be a normal soul, who knows, and immediately get nommed. Hell, if we go by old 40k lore, it's entirely possible that the moment he dies, he's shattered into 1,000 souls, and, eaten piecemeal instead. But those are the boring possibilities. Let's assume then the Emperor can become an actual god. Well, it seems then logical that he would start to interact with the real world. We know that the powers of chaos can grant visions to their subjects, usually indirectly, but occasionally directly as well. We know they can give them missions and plans and things. There's no reason why the Emperor wouldn't be able to do the same. Tell his true will to his lieutenants, to his chapter masters, to his army commanders, to his high lords, whoever he thinks he can mobilize effectively, and then begin purging the ranks of those he believes he can't trust. Indeed, there is no reason why the Emperor wouldn't simply reveal himself to the masses. Presuming there isn't a finite cap on his, telephone bill, his telepathic powers, he might as well send a message to everyone who's loyal to him saying, "Behold, I have arrived." And you've got yourself a full-scale crusade on your hand, where you've yet again mobilized the entirety of humanity. I would also imagine that he'd start empowering a great deal of servants. Now, the Chaos Gods don't throw around their blessings willy-nilly because, they can't be bothered, frankly, half the time. It's not that they wouldn't necessarily do so if absolutely pressed, but they don't really have an interest in doing so. These are not human minds, they are inscrutable entities, and so would not act in a logical manner like the Emperor presumably would. Now, this is also making the assumption that the Emperor's mind would remain intact, and that he would still seek to defeat chaos even after becoming a chaos god, which is a very valid objection. It is entirely possible that the moment the Emperor enters the warp and becomes a god, he figures, well, I'm god now. Time to start acting like one. In which case, he would become a chaos god, but for order. He would become the Imperium's chaos god. You would have demon princes of the Imperium, both like the current saints. You would have angels, the Legion of the Damned might even be a heightened, how do we put it, honor, that the various chapters might receive if they've done incredible things, and he would have several legions. He might even get to building a new crusade of the damned. Ooh, that would be cool, wouldn't it? The greatest warriors of humanity would be gathered in the Emperor's feast hall, a la Valhalla, and used in the eternal war against chaos. That could be interesting in and of itself. And it would give you a sort of pseudo-excuse for why the Emperor isn't intervening directly. He is actually intervening directly, but he's fighting chaos on its home turf, because he believes that is more beneficial in the long term, rather than attempting to conquer the real world. As, remember of course, the Emperor's original objective and way of destroying chaos was to close the chaos powers off from our galaxy. This was the point of the Imperial truth. It wasn't that the Emperor didn't know that the gods existed. Obviously he did. He simply knew that they were very, very bad people and had to be strangled to death. And the best way of doing that was to make sure that everyone was an atheist. If you convince the overwhelming majority of the galaxy that gods are not real, then the gods who literally live off faith and belief, well, they won't be real. It's likely that the Chaos powers would still be able to exist in some form or another, nourished by the belief of scattered barbarian tribes on worlds that the Imperium simply haven't bothered with, but they would be so infinitesimally weak that their abilities would be reduced to creating the occasional minor miracle for their half-clad worshippers, rather than engaging in galactic genocide. But, obviously, that was the Emperor's point of view when he was in our world. He might very well begin to re-evaluate his ideas and approach when he's in the warp as well. Or he might not. Honestly, this is one of those questions that is a little bit up in the air, isn't it? On the one hand, the Emperor's overarching goal was to destroy chaos. Would that change because he was a chaos entity himself? Would he value his own existence more than the destruction of chaos? Well, that really depends on whether or not you believe that he did what he did for humanity or for himself. Personally, I'm of the opinion that he did it for humanity. The way he was setting up the Imperium to be run in the future via representative democracy, as impossible as that in reality would be in a galaxy like that, but details, to the point where he'd even created little rooms underneath the Imperial Palace where it seemed as if he intended to live out the rest of his days with his sons as one big happy family and so on. It genuinely did appear that the Emperor had planned for his own retirement and, in essence, him eventually making himself obsolete. Now, why would he do that if all he wanted was to self-aggrandize? And I do not for a second buy the idea that all this was some grand plan to turn himself into a god, because frankly, there were easier ways to do so. The Emperor knows how the warp works. If he wanted to become a deity, he would have promoted himself as that, and then enter the warp, presumably via the webway, or some equivalent of it, which he also knew of, or simply figured out a way to transfer his existence into the warp, rather than vehemently denying that he's a god, in some sort of retarded hope that it would have the opposite effect. That's one of the dumbest theories I've heard too. Oh, the Emperor said that he wasn't a god so that people would think he's a god. Oh, help me. No, I do not for a second believe that he was playing quite such a long con. Now, it might change when he is actually a warp entity himself, at which point his self-preservation instincts might take over, not even necessarily for his own benefit. He might, after having tried to leave humanity to its devices the first time around, during the golden age of technology, having realized that wasn't going to work and taking the reins directly the second time, he might simply think, okay, well, I tried leaving them alone, that failed. Then I took direct control, and that worked out a lot better, so surely I should continue doing what worked and keep myself around so as to guide humanity. And now that he has the ability to send them prophetic visions, well, what a better way to go about it, surely? I can absolutely see the warp entity that is the Emperor make this decision, because, bear in mind as well, the warp entity is going to be a lot of the Emperor, but it will at the end of the day still be a warp entity. And one of the key core traits of anything in the warp is that it seeks to continue being in the warp. Literally, the reason why corn does what corn does is because it feeds corn. Corn likes violence. Corn creates violence. Hardly the most complicated of concepts. And an Emperor entity would probably be doing the same thing. He would look at the world and go, okay, well, my worshippers are humanity, so I'm gonna help humanity grow. What brings me strength? Well, it's making humanity grow and keeping it ordered and faithful in me, so I'm going to encourage that. Humanity's hatred also nourishes me, and so I'm going to go out of my way to make sure that they really don't like those filthy Xenos out there in the galaxy. Now, even then, this isn't a guarantee, though, because, again, Malice is an example of a Chaos God that seems to be actively trying to ruin his own existence. So it is possible for a warp entity to be, well, actively self-destructive. But is it likely? The ultimate martyrdom of the God Emperor would definitely be a nice final chapter in a book, but Beyond that, who knows? It would have a massive effect on the real world, though, as now the Imperium would be guided by an absolute, unquestionably real god. And that does make a difference. The Chaos Gods get a lot of followers because they are demonstrably real. They're obviously horrific. No normal human being would be like, gosh darn it, I would love to live in a place where people are skinned for the slightest offense, and then fed to demonic dogs. Of course not. The average citizen isn't sitting around going like, oh boy, I wish I was in the slaughter camps right now, or in Nurgle's garden, blessed with an eternal cold, or even in Slaanesha's deepest orgy pit, getting dicked by a 7-phallused cow. Most of these things run directly contrary to most humans' primary goal: staying alive, fat, and happy. But when these are the things that are enjoyed by the actual literal gods, who can create actual literal miracles, who could potentially make you into the chosen 7-phallused demonic cow, well, that does speak to that sense of self-preservation. It speaks of absolute ultimate power, of immortality, of unquestionable authority. It makes the weaker of mind subservient because, well, you're gonna go against God? Who the hell do you think you are, insignificant gnat? And it is equally appealing to the more stronger-willed because they think, so I could become a demigod, could I? And all I gotta do is suck up to these warp entities who have relatively clear written rules on how to get noticed? Well, that seems like a pretty appealing choice, frankly. To the point that there are even instances of Chaos worshippers switching sides, because the other flavor of Chaos was, well, catering to their needs more effectively than the other one was. Obviously, there are the mindless zealots too, but during the Sabbath World's Crusade, even the Blood Pact, the most ferociously loyal of Chaos servants, would join up with Anakimanar Sek, another Chaos warlord in direct opposition to their previous boss. Clearly, self-improvement and self-preservation are still things that are valued within even the masses of Chaos. If the Emperor could provide an alternative to this that was just as powerful, just as immortal, just as authoritative, etc., I imagine he'd have a pretty good grasp on the masses, and he has the advantage of being plugged into their houses, kind of directly, via, billions of churches to him, and trillions upon trillions of priests preaching his virtues, and so on and so on. The Emperor has a pretty massive leg up on the gods of Chaos, frankly, and if he was able to compete with them on their own grounds, on their own footing, it's entirely conceivable that the Emperor would just be straight up more powerful than them. Now, bear in mind, the Chaos Gods gain power from more than simple faith and worship. This is an element of it, but it is primarily a directional organ. For example, we have several tales of Khorne or Slaanesh or Nurgle creating little sub-gods that worm their way into civilizations, aspects of themselves. Where Nurgle isn't Nurgle, he is the god of darkness or the god of disease. He might even be a healer god, or even potentially a life giver on some worlds, creating little filthy bugs or something that lives out in the swamps. He might be hope on some swamp worlds. The only way you can get out of the swamp is if you embrace Nurgle, for example. And all of these minor entities still feed their power to Nurgle, indicating that it isn't necessarily the act of belief or worship in and of itself, but rather the act and the general direction that empowers them. In other words, violence would always be in the service of Khorne, no matter what, even if it isn't done in his name, meaning that even if the Emperor wages war on Khorne, that would, to a degree, empower him, as the Chaos Gods gain their strengths from simple emotions and actions and beliefs and faiths, whereas the Emperor would gain his power mostly from belief itself, and presumably, I would guess, order. Or perhaps, more correctly, acts of anti-chaos? Because merely calling him the demon god or the chaos god of order is a bit misleading, because the Emperor isn't necessarily for order in and of itself. Order by itself wasn't the Emperor's goal. If it was, he definitely wouldn't be trying to institute representative democracy. The destruction of chaos was his goal, and the best way to do so is, well, incidentally, via order, but that doesn't make him the chaos god of order. It makes him the chaos god of, well, anti-chaos, really. A quibble, to be sure, but a worthwhile one, I do believe. Of course, this all rests upon the idea that the Star Child is actually capable of doing any of this, though. That it is a vessel of the God Emperor, that it is an element of his spirit, or that it is merely a prophecy of his rebirth, or that it even exists. As it is a matter of, oh hey, this is totally a thing, we have like a placard of it somewhere. Or that it can even be brought into existence, bearing in mind that warp entities function on a bit of a different timescale than humanity. The Star Child might simply be the promise of a rebirth after destruction. Because everyone's assuming that it's the Emperor. Okay, fair enough, but why are we assuming that he'll show up in time? Huh? Oh, that's the thing. What if the galaxy is indeed doomed, either to be eaten by the Tyranids, or the Necrons, or Chaos, or whatever, and the Star Child will be the thing that re-emerges in the galaxy after it has been swept clean of life, of all existence. The Adam and the Eve, essentially, where the Emperor is reborn on a Terran-like planet 1,000 years after all life was eradicated, and begins his great work anew from absolute zero. That is as likely an explanation as anything else, really. And, well, it would at least be an interesting one, although a little bit of a, Ragnarokian cop-out, I do suppose. Oh, the world ended! But actually there's a couple of dudes left, and they're now going to get to fucking real hard to repopulate the planet. Hey, it's an old one, it's a bit of a trite, but it's tried and tested. The Bible made a pretty good job of it after all, and that's a relatively popular book. Anywho, I think I'll wrap it up there. I have wandered all over the topic, back and forth sufficiently now to satisfy my own autism. So, until next time, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.